have it here. So,
Okay.
yeah,
You want cordless?
yeah, probably better. Can hear me? You can hear me? Yeah, yeah. Okay. So, my topic that was given to me, documentation of archaeological sites and their geological context. So, I was not familiar very much with this national mission. So, I went to the website and my first slide is like, what is documented? What is the documentation form like? So you have state, district, tehsil, name of the built heritage site, date, period, location, geo. So these are all about identifying where the site is. So the more precisely you can date it, you can locate it, you can relocate it. So all these things are required. Also, like the way locals refer to it. So sometimes that is very helpful. If you can give a name that I want to go to this place, that helps you to be able to do it. So all these are quite okay, but in relationship to Paleolithic sites, it is maybe we need some additional things to be added. I understand the need to standardize, because if you cannot have, if you're going to have one database, you cannot have different fields. It becomes too complicated. So I understand that part, but I think the need, there's a need to standardize, but there's also a lot of variation in the nature of the sites. So these two things are a little bit running counter to each other. You have to compromise on one or the other. So my suggestion would be, in like, as you elaborate this national database, maybe this is the first one, which is maybe you need to have like some things which are common for all, like how do you locate the site? That has to be standard. But what has to be described from the site is very different when you have a lithic scatter and you have a temple, or you have a stray sculpture in a field or something like that. So maybe now, I also saw there were 20 types of built heritage, but sites with stone tools was not one in that 20. However, in the Antiquities, they did say that paleoliths and microliths are types of antiquities. But there was also a thing that only finished stone tools are antiquities. So now this is like completely contrary maybe to people who study these. Finished tools are only a very small part of it. You cannot ignore the whole thing. Anyway, I think this is a very good first time event, and I think standardization is very important. Now, sites where stone tools are found. This is one more kind of site which is not in the types of sites in that whole list. Now, the use of stone to make tools goes back up to 2.5 million years, and recently they have been finding some sites which are even older. And they're also like whether they were all made by one species of hominin or whether there were more. So this was very stable for many years, but recently it's going back. Now, if you think 2.5 million years, that's a long time. It's much longer in comparison to probably all of these, antiquities and sites, 400,000 sites, etc. Doesn't even include these sites, which is the most long period of human story. So now, one thing this is almost a side thing, the use of stone by humans is continuing right up to the present. So in some sense, stone tools are still used. So modern stone use is buildings, road building, and to some on a minor, like maybe some grinding stones and things like that are still used in the home. But the use of stone for making like the majority of the tools, it ended with the Iron Age. So stone tools were still being used in the Bronze Age, because the bronze was not as efficient, or maybe it was more difficult to make, I'm not sure. But you still have stone tools are still a big component of Harappan technology. So you go from 2.5 million years to 5,000 years when these stone tools are one of the major things which are, that's the major trace for human beings. I have found that sometimes Paleolithic archaeologists have been mistaking modern building material for Paleoliths. So this is one thing to be very careful about. And one observation which I have is that almost all the modern building material that I've observed, it always has 90-degree platform. Now they are artifacts. You're not wrong. It has a striking platform, it has bulbar scar, all the things by which we identify it as an artifact, because it is a production of some human activity. But for some reason, the building material, they usually have this very straight cut, because probably they want to make they may want to make the stone square, because that was not a consideration in the past. Maybe there's a different technology for detaching the stone also. So you should be aware. You should be, at least this one thought should go when you pick up a stone tool. Is it modern building material? Just think about it, and then, you know, there's no building going on nearby. You're in some, you know, that should be eliminated first. Now, okay. These stone tools are the most abundant evidence for humans in the past, with bar nothing else. Now, there's a kind of, another fact about these kind of sites. Stone tools do not survive unless they were buried, and you don't find them unless they're getting exposed. So it's not like a temple being built. It's built, and it's built by humans. It's inside your town, village, it's known, and maybe it gets out of use, it starts deteriorating, and so on. So you're looking at something very different. So to some extent, when you're locating a stone, and they also, okay, where was I? Yeah. So first of all, maybe some people will be a bit surprised when I say stone tools do not survive unless they're buried, because we consider stone as a very stable material. And we say, oh yes, the organic material has not survived, the bones have not survived, all these things have not survived, but the stone has survived. But I want to tell you that stone also has a life. And this was my first kind of insight, that stone tools also, mostly, they have to be buried for long-term survival. And this was by looking at the record for basalt tools in Maharashtra. But if I go more into detail about that, it will be one other hour lecture. So you can look at my papers. They're on ResearchGate as well as academia. And these are my first papers. You have to go like 30 years early to find these. So I used to think that this was a thing that related especially to basalt tools. Basalt is highly weatherable. But now I think this even applies to quartzite tools. You see quartzite tools also get weathered. So the basic thing, the basic difference between a tool in a good context and a tool, so first of all, don't think anything is a primary site in the sense that untouched by any geological processes since it was discarded by humans. To get buried, it has to get involved with some kind of geological process. And the worth, I mean, how primary it is how long a time it was between it getting discarded and it getting buried. So you might find, you have a river deposit. It looks like, okay, rivers, they do the same thing. But if it got incorporated in the river deposit, the next year there's flood, or it was lying on the surface for 10,000 years and then got buried, there'll be a lot of difference in the artifact. So this is the basic concept. Now, you don't find them unless they're getting exposed. That means they're already under the process of discard. I mean, if they're already buried safely, like one person was talking that he wanted to look at the Acheulean of Ganga Plain. Now the time period, the sediments of the time period for Acheulean are deeply buried. So he's not going to find them. But those are completely safe from archaeologists, safe from destruction. Now, where that Acheulean period sediment might be exposed, where the bedrock is closer to the surface, then you will start to get Acheulean sites. So there also, there may be the sediment which is not being buried, not being exposed, and the sediment which is getting exposed. So this is the very first rule of finding these sites. You have to look for where the older sediments are exposed. So this could be natural exposure, or it could be artificial exposure. But in both cases, it means when you identify this site, you have to give very thorough documentation, because you don't know how much longer it will be there. Because if it's a natural process, it's getting exposed by the river floods, then maybe the whole thing will be washed out, or what you see this year is what was washed out last year. You come back 3-4 years later, and some other artifacts have been washed out, because it's the sediments which have saved them. So here you're looking at, the river is in a way doing archaeological work. It's excavating for you. So that is one thing. Then also artificial exposures also could give you access to some older artifacts. So it's very important that if ideally, there should be observation of all these artificial digging and so on. Now, in case you find something in an artificial exposure, then its lifetime is even much less than the natural exposure. So I think for documentation, this has the implication that it's not something you can do and then do better. Maybe it's something you can only do once. So perhaps it has to be a little bit more intensive documentation, and there should be a systematic collection and documentation of the artifacts also. Now the next thing, let me see. This is the implications. Next slide. So, is it documentation, or then this comes into more of salvage archaeology, which is documenting these things as they get exposed. Next slide. Okay, so I guess this was on the previous slide, but when you see artifacts on the surface, it's very important that they are not surface artifacts. They have recently been exposed by some sediment. So you really have to make an effort. Where are they coming from? So the stratigraphy of the site, the horizon of the artifacts this requires a little bit more work. So for the first normally we just report the location of where we found the surface scatter. But actually you need to know which horizon it's coming from. Maybe they're all completely removed from context. There are no more. That whole sediment that is yielding them is gone. But but ideally, we should document and understand the sediments from which they are coming, which horizon they are coming from, and then even if the site is going to be destroyed by natural or artificial processes, some documentation of the sediments is very important, because all of this Paleolithic archaeology, it's part of the geological processes. And in some extent, I even don't like to use the word geoarchaeology, because knowing this geology is so important for the archaeology. I don't think you can do it without it. So if it's an essential part of Paleolithic archaeology, then it's not geology. It is Paleolithic archaeology. So in that sense, I don't like the word geoarchaeology, not because I think it's not important, but I think it's essential to this period. So, so just as in Europe, they will keep some, part of the cave. They will not dig out all the cave sediments. If it's at all possible, some part of the site should be preserved. So I had gone to Germany, and where they had found that Homo heidelbergensis. This whole thing is preserved, the quarry wall. And I think after 100 years, 2007, they had done, because it was the 100 years, they just took a very small scraping so that they could do some dating and so on. So this was something after 100 years they had preserved that sediment there. So we have to do this for some of our sites. This concept is completely not there. Okay, next slide. Now this is just a slide which I pulled out to show you, like, only some part of the landscape you have to search for artifacts. So this is a satellite image of Narmada. I've done PhD and later work here. And you can see all these white patches are the exposed sediments of the Narmada. And this is where you find the artifacts. So in some cases, and these go back, we have right from Acheulean to Chalcolithic artifacts here. So here, you know, like a couple of excavations have also been done, like Pipri and Utaward. Ota has done, those were Chalcolithic sites. And they're on these quite far south, on the southern Nalas. So it took a long time, but, you know, like, why are the sites there? And then we realized that actually it's a southern channel of the Narmada. And the Narmada is shifted northwards. This is the, you know, these are the sediments from which you're getting artifacts. This is the Nahili Nadi. So it comes this way and it makes a sharp turn, you know? So this zone is the old Narmada channel. And it was along here that a number of Chalcolithic sites were excavated by S.B. Ota. And they had fish hooks and stuff like that. So it didn't make sense, like, where were the fish? This is completely dry. And then I realized, and there also we had in wells here, you have Acheulean artifacts, 60 feet, about 20 meters below the surface, coming from a gravel. You have Acheulean artifacts. So this was the Narmada channel from Acheulean to Chalcolithic times, and then it shifted. There's a mountain here, there's a hill. And it never occurred to me that the river would be on the other side of the hill. But the river was flowing here, and then it shifted to this after the Chalcolithic time. And all throughout here, it's cutting through bedrock. This is a very young channel of the Narmada. Then we also have a site, Karondia, which had all these Chalcolithic, two early historical, like there were a number of pits, and each pit had a different kind of pottery. We had at another site, Kaparkera, we had some 15,000-year-old microliths with ostrich eggshell beads, and then we had the actual early historical Chalcolithic site. So there is a huge amount of archaeological material. You observe something every day that you are walking. In any of these, it's just full of evidence for humans. Now, documenting it, recording it is one thing, and studying it and understanding is another one. Okay, next slide. Okay, yeah. So this is just to show you, so what kind of geological processes bury the tools? So this is again on Narmada. This is a site called Metakeri, in which you can see this is all Narmada sediment. And people are always close to the rivers, so there are artifacts in this section. We didn't find any artifacts in this part, but this gave a date of 35,000. No, this sand gives the date of 35,000. I suspect, since there are no artifacts, this might be very young. And then between this, there's another sand here, which is 56,000, and in between we get microliths. Then below this, the number of artifacts becomes very less, but there are artifacts, and from an excavation in 2009, there's a date of about 64,000 from this level. So this is the same section with labels. This is part of documentation. So you can see here, we have this whole channel in which we have taken samples, soil samples, at 5 centimeter intervals, so that if we do some sedimentological analysis, then we will have a kind of time, a record of the time. And these are the OSL samples, which we can completely relate to the other data because they will be in a certain layer. And you can check it by looking at, like, okay, where did this sample really come from? And we have this picture. And all these things are samples taken for micromorphology. So the actual structure of the soil can be studied under the microscope. So you can look at, like, not just look at like how much carbonate, but how the carbonate looks in the section. So all these things, I mean, we have not been able to do all of it, but I think if the site is going to be destroyed, this level of documentation is probably needed. This is not a huge excavation, but you need to expose the sediments, know where they're coming from, collect the samples for dating. So now this is like the time which is earlier than radiocarbon dating, but this OSL dating is a very good method for that time period. So in fact, the whole reason I excavated this after retirement was because from this locality there was an ostrich eggshell date with shell which gave a more than beyond radiocarbon date. The date had come from here. And you know, so okay, next section. So this is the same site, another trench. And here, just another example, like we have taken 4 trenches there, and every trench has a different sediments. So here we have this black clay. This is all 100,000 years, maybe 80 to 120,000 years. We don't have a date for the top, but the middle of it is 100,000 years. And then you think like here, suddenly you see this gravel. That's the erosional contact. It's full of the older tools, but the date is 3,000 years. So it's so complex. You have to, you know, so now what was eroded above that was, we have in another trench 2 different archaeological horizons. So that means this thing that was eroded at 3,000 years, it would have both of them. So even it'll be very difficult to understand. Then you can see like this is a kind of, you know, modern deposit. And then we had taken 1 year, we had taken this trench, but when we extended it, there's a whole different lens of sediment here. And this was full of ostrich eggshells. No microliths. These are quite old ostrich eggshells, but we have not yet got a date for that. So here you're looking at one of the contexts for how these artifacts survived. Now, this is the simplest, even though it's so complex. This is a river. The river has deposited this sediment in a certain time. And usually, at least in this Narmada, the artifacts are in very good context because because basically you have the river flood, and then you have like the river flood, the flood on the river is something like 12 hours, 10 hours, and then it goes down. And then maybe you won't have such a high flood for another 10 or 20 years. So during that time, people are occupying this surface, leaving their tools, and then maybe after this 15, 20 years, it gets covered with another flood. So the flood is not really disturbing the artifacts, they are preserving them. On the other hand, in the Godavari and Bhima basin, I get the same period artifacts, mostly in gravels. So there, it's a small gravel, and they are sometimes rolled and so on. But still, sometimes the gravels are artifacts which are very fresh. So even the nature of the river could be different. So anyway, the fluvial sediments, whatever their complications, are still simple compared with a lot of sites in India. Next slide. Okay, this is another fluvial. This is another favorite section. This is Jabalpur, where I guess we did this work in 1 day. So this could be considered like documenting. So here's the satellite image. Where you can see, this is the Duadar Falls. But you see, this is an overflow channel and maybe an earlier channel of the Narmada. So in this zone, this is where you see all these massive sediments. So the top of it is all uniform and not that easily exposed. But the first time I went there in '92, there had been a massive flood the year before, And this whole thing was very well exposed. So what you could see, the lower level was a red fissured clay. This is taken from the paper, so yeah. And then you had a sandy pebbly gravel, another clay, and then there were 2 gravels. And in between there was huge boulders and fossils. So above this, there's a date of 26,000 microliths. And below it, you start to get you have these hand axes. So above you can see, I would call it a cleaver on chert, and this is a small hand axe on quartzite, which came from this gravel. So if you think of the age difference between microliths, here dated to 26,000, and Acheulean, even the latest phase of Acheulean, you have a couple of 100,000 years missing in that section. So this is the context for the hand axe and also for the cleaver. Next slide. Now, when you look at many places, you see the artifacts are occurring away from the river, where there's no river channel. And there also you have some kind of sediments getting deposited. But what are they? What processes are producing them? This is something no geology or geomorphology textbook really talks about. There's no good model for it. Next slide. So here you can see, this is the kind of deposit in which lots of artifacts occur in India. This is like a hill slope. You can see this is so thick, This is like a few meters of this rubble, silt, and you can see distinctly the color difference. This is more probably modern, and this is older. So this is near Sambalpur, and artifacts are in plenty wherever this is disturbed, and also like this is still on the slope. Afterwards you have a wide apron of sediments. And there was a water tank had been scooped out, and all the disturbed sediments were full of artifacts. Mostly, I would consider them probably, they were not Acheulean, they were not microliths, so they were Middle Paleolithic. And this is a visit I made with a student to Sassonia, and they dug this trench for trying to date the lowest part of the sediments here, and they did find one artifact. But this Sassonia Hill, this is one of the most important Paleolithic sites in West Bengal. It's so different from what I was showing you of Narmada and so on. That's why I wanted to visit it, because so you have this hill, and all around it there's an apron of sediments. You have the rubble, you have the transported ferricrete, and you have these silty deposits. Some places you even have calcrete, and I think I had thousands of hand axes have been collected from this. So you don't find much there now, and also there has been a lot of leveling and shifting of the surface deposits. Next slide. This is another site called Paisra, which is similar to Sassonia. Again, you can see the mountains, and you see all these slope deposits, and this is where the trenches were taken. There's no river here, but there are the sediments, and they are full of artifacts. So this is taken from the internet, from the cover of their book. This is the picture on the cover of the book, and this is one of the artifacts illustrated within their book. So this is a very beautiful hand axe coming out of this re-cemented ferricrete. Next slide. Yes, some question? Yeah, it's but see how it's actually a very, if it's this way. No, you can't see it that well. I think it's completely flaked on both sides. It's a very refined flaking. And maybe this picture doesn't give the view. I think this is it's this shape. So it's kind of an ovate hand axe. Now there is an idea that ovate hand axes are the evolved forms of cleavers because they have the same kind of sharp edge, okay? So that is why I'm completely against people, thinking that you can just put every artifact into one name. This is sometimes very misleading. And when you're not, people who are not experienced, they over Like they want to put it into a type, so something which is just should be called a flake will be called a scraper, a denticulate, a knife, and whatever, that whole list of names, notch, this, that. So basically, I would just say that this is definitely a finished tool. You know? Next slide. Okay, so the fluvial channel processes are comparatively well understood by geologists, but these other surface processes are not so well understood. So there are, next slide. Yeah, I think one reason is that Indian environment has some very unique features. And so what is written in the textbooks is not actually true for India. Not true for India. Because the work which they are writing about was not done in India. So first thing, the most important thing is the extreme seasonality of the climate. So when you read in the textbooks, this is very important for archaeology because this was one of the first relative dating methods. In Northern Europe, you have the Seine River and the Somme River and the Thames River. They all belong to the same channel river. And there are all these terraces at higher levels. And the higher terraces have older tools, and the lower terraces have younger tools. So the river has been down-cutting through the Quaternary time. And this is because the land has been uplifting. So there has been a reducing base level. Now, when I started my PhD work in Narmada, I found that the older tools are occurring at, say, 15 meters above the river in one place, and they're occurring at the river level in the next place, next locality. So that means there's no base level change. No base level change means no tectonics. So I was like, for 20, 25 years, I was no tectonics. Geologists were always like, tectonics the most important thing in geology. So every geologist was like, tectonics. And I was like, oh, what do they know? They're wrong. But then, it was, I guess, 2001, 2002, we had some field work. And this was a section on the Narmada where the beds were just completely tilted, going up and down. And I was like, I'm wrong, you know? For 20 years I was wrong, the geologists were right, okay? So there is, like, they have done work, but I was right, there are no terraces. So then I realized that probably a terrace is like a uplifted floodplain. These rivers do not have floodplains because the maximum flood is so much more than the daily flood. So the Narmada is also the most extreme version of this. Like, I think the maximum floods are like 100 times what the base flow is of the river. So whatever happens in that flood, and it's only an event of hours, not even days, that cannot be exceeded by anything else. And I have like my personal anecdote, like when I was first excavating at Methakeri, we were staying in a place where there was only one bathroom for 12 people. So I told everyone, we'll give you 2-hour or 3-hour lunch break, go and take bath in the river. Don't take part where we are living. So that made it like much less pressure. So every day you're going to the river and you're walking to where the water is deep enough to take the bath. And I telling you, in that 1 month, each pebble I could recognize. This is the one which is sharp, this is the one which is slippery, this is the one you have to jump over. You know, like friends they were. That means in that 1 month, not ek pathar nahi hilta hai, nothing. But in that 100 times in the flood, every single pebble will move, okay? So this is a condition where the river is not forming terraces because it's not forming floodplains. But what I found is almost every Indian river, it only shifts in one direction. So it's something more like a tilting of a plate. So in this area, all the older sediments are on the southern side of the river. And that is because probably Satpuras are uplifting more in relation to the Vindhyans. But in 1 or 2 localities, it's the opposite. Like at Barwa, these older sediments are on the northern side. So here the Vindhyans are probably uplifting more. So that you see almost every Godavari is moving towards south. Narmada is moving towards north. And in between you have the Satpuras. So it's even the same with Ganga. It's moving in one direction. Almost every tributary is moving continuously more in one direction than the other. So there is tectonics, but the rivers respond in a different way because the rivers in India are different. Then you have another thing in the Indian context is India was a detached continent near to the equator in the tertiary period when the climate was the maximum warmth, maximum humidity that it ever has been. Conditions were maximum for weathering. So it passed through this whole climate and it's shifting out of that. So there's a progressive aridity, but this inherited weathered surface is being stripped off. So you can see the progressive stripping through the time period of when humans were here. So like for one example, there's the basin to the south of Pune, the Karha Basin. There is no laterite anywhere in the basin. So there is no laterite can come into the basin. But in the earliest sediments there, we get laterite. So between Acheulean period and now, the laterite has been stripped off, no longer exists. So you see these kind of, also almost all the Acheulean sites are associated with clay. Today all the rivers are gravelly. The Acheulean tools have double patina. That means the flaked surface, because they're old, has got a patina, but the unflaked surface has a deeper patina. That means they were not using river pebbles, but they were collecting the material from the regolith. This is no longer the case. So you're seeing like how the landscape has changed. On the other hand, we still get evidence that it was arid, because you get, like in some of this black, and I've observed at Bori in the black clay, there's a lens of only calcrete nodules. That means that calcrete has eroded from the sediment when that sediment was being accumulated. So it was already having calcrete. And at Morgaon, I observed a cleaver sitting on black clay. Above there is gravel. When I was making the section, this gravel was very odd. It suddenly went down and up. I was like, what kind of gravel? And then light bulb. The gravel's filling a crack in the clay. So this thing of cracking and that vertisol processes were there in the Acheulean period. So the Acheulean period might have been slightly more humid than today, but it was still in the semi-arid climate. But the sediments are different because what is being supplied, this tertiary inherited regolithic material is being slowly stripped off. And I think Indians should be realize that all this soil, all our prosperity is actually on something which is not contemporary. It's a relic from this past when India was at the equator. Then, progressive aridification that I've already said. So climate is global, but tectonics is not. So you get variation in which age of material you have. So in Maharashtra, the Sayadri, the rivers coming from the Sayadris, the Western Ghats, these have really early Acheulean. But the Narmada does not. The Narmada, the earliest stuff is early post-Acheulean, and few sites with Acheulean. So it doesn't have the older sediments. So basically, if you cannot get the sites if there is no sediment surviving of that time period. And there are gaps everywhere. That's why you need to have patch together the whole story from looking at what's present in different regions. The need to you have to understand how the tools got buried and how they got exposed. And that without that, you really don't understand. Even typology is not understood. So one of my 86 paper about Nivasian, it was considered like a separate time period, but it was in the same gravel. So then okay, do you have these two different technologies which were both existing at the same time, Acheulean and Middle Paleolithic? But my realization that There's a lot of difference between the weathering of siliceous rocks, like here it was agate and chert, and basalt. It basically, Nivasian is Acheulean without the basalt. So because the siliceous rocks were occurring as small nodules, you could not make hand axes and cleavers out of them. But so they were only on basalt. So you remove the basalt and then you remove the large tool component. And then it looks like that it's a different technology. So you have to understand the geological processes, even to understand like what is it. Next, so I think this whole thing now, in India, we say primary, secondary. There's a gradation. No site is primary because every site needed to be buried. Some geological process has been active on it. But it's not like it's primary or secondary. I think there's a gradation. Even when you look at the river deposit, you could see something very abraded, you could see something very fresh. How much time it took between it being discarded and buried. And in my general experience, it's actually artifacts which have been buried in dust, aeolian dust. They are really the least disturbance by geological processes. Next slide. So I think what is one of the last things I want to say is when we're talking about historical period, Chalcolithic period, by that time the world has differentiated into different cultural groups and we identify with them. So when we talk about Indian, most of these temples, art, Yevo, it's related to the development of India. And it doesn't have the same, everyone is not interested in what happened in India. We are, and then our heritage is so spectacular that it is of interest to everyone. In that sense, I wouldn't say that way. But when you go into the past, then these are really, you can't understand what happened to humans to come to this stage without knowing about all parts of the world. And because of the very low amount of work done on Paleolithic in India, you look at any account of human evolution, India's missing, nothing. As if there were no Indians in India. So this is a big challenge and you cannot blame anyone except us. We're not doing the work, we're not giving it importance. So this is one part of the Indian past which is important on that level of how humans evolved. Next slide. No, that was the last one. Okay, I think this is not my updated version. Updated, I'd put another one that I can't tell you the whole story because then it would be much longer. But I think India was very critical in human evolution. And according to me, there are two major turning points in human evolution. The first is the transition from Australopithecus to Homo erectus. And the second is modern humans' dispersal. So I'm already fairly convinced that Acheulean and Homo erectus evolved in India. It went from India to Africa, and not Africa to India. Now my reasons for that, I have expressed in a number of papers. But basically, there's in India, we have only 3 or 4 sites dated. Already they date almost the same as Africa. The resemblance of the tools is almost the same. But in Africa, they have a very good record. They've got dozens or maybe more than that sites dated. And this Acheulean appears at the same time as Homo erectus. And there is nothing preceding it which at all gradual. Homo erectus, Homo habilis, and Australopithecus boisei, they all occur in the same bed. And Australopithecus boisei survives a bit, Homo habilis immediately becomes extinct. And this happens both in North Africa, East Africa, and South Africa. Whereas prior to this, you had different species of Australopithecus in East Africa and South Africa. You have no stone tool use in South Africa compared with East Africa. So these Australopithecines even didn't spread within Africa. They were independently evolving. So now, what do you think? The date is the same, the tools are the same, Homo erectus is the same. Is it Africa or India? Now when you come, like another argument I have made to link Acheulean with Homo erectus. So Acheulean is in India and Homo erectus is in Java. How do you connect this? They have no tools, we have no fossils. So the thing is that now they're sort of pushing the age of Homo erectus a little bit younger. But the crucial thing is, as soon as Java became land, the first animals to reach were giant tortoise and stegodon from India. And the second was Homo erectus with lots of other fauna. So the earliest Homo erectus in Java is associated with a fauna which has migrated from India. Now, I think that's very, very convincing evidence. On the other hand, they don't have Acheulean, but like I've told you how easy it is. Tools don't survive that easily. So there's one site in Java where they have a few large tools, that's Nebung. And some of them are completely cleavers. They can just fit into that Morgon assemblage very well. So I think that basically they're missing the tools, but if Homo erectus in India had Acheulean, then I think Homo erectus in Java also had Acheulean. So this is the first thing. Then with modern humans, I thought, all right, maybe Homo erectus evolved in India, but modern humans, all the thing is that they evolved in Africa. But there is a lot of time gap between the appearance of Homo erectus and their final, actually dispersing and all the other archaic humans kind of getting absorbed or extinct, outcompeted by modern humans. So you have earliest modern humans by 200,000 plus, mostly around the Mediterranean basin, because now you have Israel, Greece, Morocco, as East Africa. So this is really more oriented towards the Mediterranean zone. And these are dating to 200,000, but there's not much difference between the artifacts of this time period, whether they are modern humans or whether they are Neanderthals or some other kind of archaic humans. But at around 40, they've got very good data from Europe, between 39 and 41,000 modern humans replaced Neanderthals in Europe, and they spread into Central Asia and Middle East is slightly earlier than that. And you have some sporadic appearance going back to 55,000, both in France as well as in Israel. Now in India, this microliths which we are getting from sites like Methakeri, and also Vishnupriya Basak also has some old sites in Bengal, not quite as old as mine, but getting there. The sediments are not older, that's why. Otherwise, if you got the older sediment, you'll get the older tools. I don't think there's going to be any difference in the age anywhere. So far, we had a date from the previous excavation at Methakeri, which by averaging, it's like somewhere 44, 45,000. But if you take the oldest date, it's 48,000. And 48,000 is the only date which matches with the radiocarbon date. So from there, we had a radiocarbon date more than 42,000, which now, if they have a calibration, more than 42,000 would be more than 46,000. And the only date which is more than 46,000 was the 48,000. Now we have a date below it, which is 56,000. So now we have maybe a maximum age, and somewhere between that, we have to narrow it. But what is below 56,000 is also related to microliths, but there are some differences. Now, microliths are it's the only technology which is exclusively used by modern humans. So I'm very sure that these microliths are modern. Now, I'm not saying that modern humans couldn't even enter at stage 5. Maybe the replacement of modern humans coming at stage 4 of the modern humans that were already here in stage 5. But in that earlier time, there is not any any technology which is distinctive to modern humans. Okay, so that would still be like, okay, we don't know. We need some more data to know. So I think like this Paleolithic of India is a very important part of Indian archaeology. And I hope that my coming here is like at least like promoting that everybody should start thinking in that same way. Thank you.
Here. Sector 2. Sector 2.
A big thanks, ma'am. Thank you very much for your this significant lecture and your elaborate interpretation. Now, we would like to call our respected professor, Professor Shanti Bapu ma'am, and she will deliver themed on documentation of prehistoric antiquities. Over to you, ma'am.
No, my family is not there. Recently, my Baba and Ma, they came and joined me because they are 86 years. So, but they are in good condition now. Still, they are walking and moving, and so there's no sugar.
On the same street, my wife's maternal uncle's house.
Achha.
Mommy passed away from this time.
Recently there was some. So just corner.
I live in BA 13.
Yes, BA 13.
13.
13 है ना सर BA. जी सर मैं बताता हूँ.
BA 13 flat.
तिवारी जी कभी पूछते हैं सर, राकेश तिवारी सर आपके बारे में पूछते हैं. Actually, we are close to ना because he's जानकीपुरा, उनके सामने हमारा घर है, बस just walking distance पे है. जी सर.
You will not get time or any other
सर से चाय पिएंगे
such as this to ask her questions. So by the time Professor Shanti Bapu is
कुछ अच्छा सा खिलाओ सर को क्या है?
you can ask questions.
Actually, ma'am, you just give a very big instance.
Tushar is our junior. I call him several times.
Of Bengal, India.
Gentle boy.
Head of this Paleolith of Africa. There, ma'am, I need a bit elaboration if you kindly expedite the matter. Because geologically, ma'am, if you can just expedite.
4, 3, 8, 6, 4, 4, 2.
Take this one, it's working.
Yeah, okay, now this is working. You have to press a button first. No, so the artifacts are not the same all the time everywhere. But one thing which was another point which I found, I did a review of Lower Paleolithic of the world that Sundara had asked me to do it. And I took 2 years, I did it. But the only area in the world where you do not have Acheulean as well as some other Lower Paleolithic industries.
This is really.
So I think Acheulean in India is
It's very problematic, even though I am confused.
The Acheulean, is what we are calling large
How I
lake
can
Acheulean,
save it?
that is really very similar to Africa, the earliest Acheulean in Africa. But when we come to this Middle Paleolithic period, then I think there's nothing really, that everything is different. But there's some general similarities. In this time you have points, you have blades, you have retouch tools, you have multiple different kinds of chain operatoires for deriving specialized flakes. So all these things are there, but so
I got
similar
it,
in
sir.
that
Now,
sense.
thoda time
I think
lagta
if you
create a new
probably look
context.
at each industry,
Rajendra Yadav karte hain sir aise.
so there would be major
Rajendra
differences also. But
Yadav.
nobody has really studied them to that level.
Poll
And
kar
then
dein,
people
poll,
have
aise poll.
not, like somebody who
ASI
knows
kar
North
sakte hain,
Africa,
right.
doesn't know Israel, doesn't know Middle East, that person doesn't know India, In India, we're still like, what is Middle Paleolithic? We actually had this almost disappeared, a black hole in Indian prehistory. So because they're not, we are actually confusing a lot of Middle Paleolithic things with Acheulean. So that was another thing, like I realized very late, that we have something very distinctive, like hand axes, Acheulean, cleavers, Acheulean, microliths. Then what is in between? So I found that probably the end of the Acheulean is already before 500,000 years. If that is true, then there's a big gap between 500,000 and 50,000 years.
There's a generation gap because also become obsolete for this young. In front of youngsters, they are very quick and very fast.
Atirapakam has a date of about almost 300,000.
Yeah, 1A
Similarly, this Anil Devra
he's
has some
Manish
sites
Verma
from Andhra Pradesh
from
in
UP.
that.
So he's an English speaking guy, or don't have much. English is a poor because in UP and other areas the English is not a primary language special.
So they
but
were
it is
being
good. Somehow the entire exhibition,
Acheulean,
the conference is managing this.
like flake blade industry.
So he's a very, in another way, he's a very, very tough guy.
But
managing
I think this is
very
whole,
well.
Almost 500,000
Sunipa was here. So Sunipa was transferred to RD office. Then Panda came, Sanjay Panda came to my office.
And Acheulean was found
He's
all
the
over the world.
ASA.
These are the two kind of
We are only three.
two kind of major evolutionary
One A, one ASA, one SA. And olden days they were the two deputies, two ASAs, and 3, 4, 5 A, one
is the
SA.
most complex. We have no proper living model for human behavior in that time.
हरिओम पहले वो बड़ौदा में थे सर मैं उधर बम्बई में था
You told in your lecture there is
दोनों
no
बस पहले
primary sites
इसमें आ
in
गए
India.
थे
But if, because of this, most of the sites are river valley sites. But when it comes to the Bhimbetka, Adamgarh, so why do you put this? That's the first question. And second question, ma'am, your theory we understood, but thing is that India is a lack of fossil remains. Only except this Narmada man, we are not finding any fossil from India. So how could we prove this? On the basis of stone tools, it's difficult, ma'am. That's why, because now it's genetical model, now it's DNA model, mtDNA, Y chromosome. They are proving these things.
No, so like obviously, I had 45 minutes, and I was trying to see how much I exceeded because probably I did. But so I have not given you everything. So. What was the first thing? Like, oh yeah, why don't we get fossils? Primary size, okay. See, that is, I just find, this one of my pet, it just makes me angry. Saying primary, secondary, okay. And then the alternative thing is, once I met some American archaeologists, oh, your sites are secondary. No. What I want to say is everything you have to study, everything has a meaning, everything tells you something. In fact, individual artifact by artifact, you have to take the story. Every artifact to survive needed some story, how it survived. So there is some process between it being discarded. Now, if it's a perfect site that just, people got up and immediately it got buried, there may be some such sites. There may be some such sites close to it. But if you just do this categorization, and then the categorization is wrong. Like, oh, I understand that your river site is secondary. But Adamgarh, Bhimbetka, those are primary because they didn't come in the river. But in fact, what I was telling you, the river has less disturbance to the site than this lying on the surface until it gets buried by roof fall or some other process which is very slow. So if you look at the Adamgarh or Bhimbetka artifacts, they are so weathered. They have a thick weathering rind. Sometimes you cannot even read them or understand them properly. So it's not primary. So each geological, but we don't understand the geological process in a cave. This kind of cave. It's not like the caves in Europe. These are all quartzite. It's a very tough rock. Most of the, so the cave, like something is falling from the roof, but something may be blowing in. Like R.V. Joshi, that we were going to try and remember him for 100 years on December 15th. It's just a few days later. I've never found where he wrote this, but Rajguru told me that he was sure that in Adamgarh, the microliths were in a black clay. And how could it get into the cave? So he was always saying this must be wind-blown dust. Now I've been looking, where did he write it down? This is like oral, like, you know, I heard, Rajguru told me that R.V. Joshi had this idea. Fossils like bones are much more easily destroyed than tools. So if you think, and on the other thing, if you look at, if you kind of make a catalog, what are the important sites in the world, you know? You'll find that the really spectacular sites are either associated with caves or volcanic deposits. And if you go to the, then okay, like 90% of the biggest, most important sites in the world are in these two categories of geology. And you go to the geology textbook, how much of geology is that? 1%, 2%. How much of the earth is caves or volcanoes or the deposits from volcanoes? Not much. And both of these things are absent from our country, like the rock shelters and so on. They are not preserving very old sediments. It's not like the ideal place. And people didn't need to hide in caves because the climate is quite good. You need protection from sun, that's it. Mostly sun, rain. Umbrellas were invented in India for protection from the sun, not for protection from the rain. So it's like, these may not be the very attractive places to live, the caves in India. So then you have these general geological processes in which, so like if you think of actually for me, the best case scenario was the river deposit of Narmada, where maybe you have one flood and 20 years later you have another flood. Okay, so the tools are preserved quite well. Like some levels we get refitting and so on. But that 20 years for bones to get destroyed, it's like quite a lot. So basically we are getting most of the fossils in India are found in the river gravels, and lots of species are not in that. Not only humans, even I think tigers, they've only got 1 or 2. Probably there were giraffes, they have 0. So maybe humans were not so tied to the rivers. Maybe they were able to escape getting buried in the floods, drowning. And we do get one fossil. We have one. There is that Narmada person. Yeah.